Imagine a person who slowly destroys your reality. Not with violence. Not with screaming. But with calm certainty. He looks at you and says, "That never happened." He smiles and says, "You're too emotional." He sighs and says, "You're lucky to have me." And slowly you begin to doubt your own memory. You replay conversations in your head at night. You question your instincts. You apologize for things you're not sure you did. Your world shrinks. Your confidence erodes. Your perception bends. Now imagine that this person runs a country. Pause. Imagine millions of people slowly questioning their own memory, their own judgment, their own sense of reality. The most disturbing part? The methods are the same. Only the scale is different. From manipulator to dictator, the mechanism does not change. It expands. And tonight, we descend into that mechanism. Not as politics. Not as ideology. But as psychology. Because power is not born in parliaments. It is born in the human mind. And if you understand the mechanism in one relationship, you understand it in a nation. This is the story of scaling control. Power does not appear fully formed. It does not begin with armies, flags, or grand speeches. It begins quietly, inside one human nervous system. One person learns how to bend another person's perception. That is the seed. Everything else is agriculture. Think of control as a technology. In its simplest form, it is used in a relationship. One manipulator. One target. A contained laboratory of psychological influence. He studies reactions. He tests boundaries. He adjusts tone. He experiments with silence. When he withdraws affection, what happens? When he raises his voice slightly, what happens? When he praises, then criticizes, what happens? This is not chaos. It is calibration. Machiavelli understood this calibration centuries ago. In The Prince, he did not romanticize power, he dissected it. He observed rulers as a biologist observes predators. His insight was surgical. People are less guided by morality than by perception of strength and consequence. A ruler must learn to appear virtuous while being ready to act without virtue. Appearance first. Reality second. That principle is not confined to palaces. It lives in relationships. The domestic manipulator is not always loud. Often, he is patient. He understands something fundamental. Reality is not what happens. Reality is what is interpreted. An interpretation can be influenced. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that truth itself can become a tool. He wrote that there are no facts, only interpretations. In the wrong hands, that insight becomes a weapon. If everything is interpretation, then the strongest interpretation wins. The loudest narrative becomes truth. In a relationship, the stronger personality defines what really happened. In a nation, the stronger narrative defines history. Now scale it. Replace the living room with a nation. Replace the intimate conversation with a broadcast. Replace private doubt with collective uncertainty. The mechanism does not change. The audience multiplies. In a relationship, the manipulator controls one narrative. In a state, the architect of power controls the dominant narrative. The principle is identical. Control perception, and you control behavior. People do not act based on truth. They act based on what they believe is true. That is the fulcrum. If I can influence what you believe about yourself, I influence what you tolerate. If I can influence what a population believes about its condition, I influence what it accepts. Gustave Le Bon described this transformation in The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. He observed that individuals in a crowd do not think like isolated individuals. They become suggestible, emotional, Impulsive. A crowd does not require detailed argument. It requires a simple image. A symbol. A repeated phrase. In a relationship, repetition creates doubt. In a nation, repetition creates doctrine. One sentence, repeated long enough, becomes reality. The domestic manipulator says, "You're overreacting," until the partner begins to ask, "Am I?" A regime repeats, "We are under threat," until the population feels it in their bones, even without visible danger. The human nervous system does not distinguish well between repeated narrative and lived experience. It responds to intensity and frequency. Carl Jung warned about something darker, the shadow. The part of the psyche that contains aggression, envy, hunger for dominance. He argued that when individuals fail to confront their shadow, it projects outward. Now imagine a leader who has integrated his shadow, who understands his own capacity for manipulation, and is willing to use it. He becomes dangerous not because he is chaotic, but because he is conscious. Jung also spoke of archetypes, ancient patterns in the collective unconscious. The strong father. The savior. The warrior. A manipulator in a relationship may unconsciously play the protector. Only I can keep you safe. A political leader may embody the same archetype on a national scale. Only I can protect the nation. The archetype bypasses logic. It speaks to something ancient. Something pre-rational. This is why scaling works. It plugs into universal psychological circuits. Here is the mental model. Perception is the operating system. Behavior is the application. If you rewrite the operating system, every application runs differently. Change how a person sees themselves, they change how they act. Change how a nation sees itself, it changes what it permits. Hannah Arendt later described how totalitarian systems do not rely solely on terror. They rely on the restructuring of reality itself. When the line between fact and fiction dissolves, people lose the ground beneath their feet. And when people lose stable ground, they cling to the strongest voice in the room. The genius of scaling is that it does not require every citizen to be oppressed physically. It requires them to internalize a version of reality. Once internalized, control becomes self-enforcing. In a relationship, the victim begins to police their own thoughts. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I misunderstood. In a nation, citizens begin to censor themselves. Maybe it's safer not to question. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong. This is the quiet victory of scaled manipulation. External pressure becomes internal restraint. Ask yourself, when does control become invisible? When the controlled begin to defend the controller? When the abused defends the abuser? When the citizen justifies the erosion of their own freedoms? That is not stupidity. That is psychological adaptation. Humans adapt to reduce anxiety. If reality feels unstable, we prefer a simple explanation. Even if it costs us autonomy. This is why scaling works. It exploits universal human needs. Safety, belonging, clarity. A manipulator offers clarity in exchange for submission. A ruler offers stability in exchange for obedience. The transaction feels rational in the moment. Especially in chaos. Especially in uncertainty. History does not create new personalities. It amplifies existing ones. The domestic manipulator studies one face across a dinner table. The authoritarian studies millions through polls, reactions, and media signals. Both are reading feedback. Both are adjusting strategy. Both understand that overt force is expensive. Psychological control is efficient. Force creates resistance. Perception management creates consent. Power is not physical dominance. Power is the ability to define what is normal. What is acceptable? What is true? Once you define, those people enforce the boundaries themselves. This is the principle of scaling. The mechanism of control is fractal. It looks the same at every level: relationship, organization, nation. Zoom in or zoom out. The pattern repeats. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Power is not force. Power is control over perception. And when perception bends, reality follows. Gaslighting does not begin with shouting. It begins with contradiction. Quiet. Repeated. Surgical. In a relationship, it sounds almost harmless. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too sensitive. The first time, you resist. The second time, you argue. The third time, you hesitate. And hesitation is the fracture point. Because memory is not a recording device. It is reconstructive. Fragile. Emotional. Each time you revisit it, it shifts slightly. The manipulator understands this intuitively. He does not need to erase your memory. He only needs to introduce doubt. A small crack in certainty. Once doubt enters, you begin doing his work for him. You replay the event. You adjust the tone in your mind. You question your reaction. Eventually, you ask him what really happened. And in that moment, authority transfers. Not through force. Through epistemology. He becomes the source of truth. Now scale it. Replace the private argument with public discourse. Replace whispered contradiction with broadcast certainty. Gaslighting at a national level does not look like a lover's denial. It looks like rewriting history. It looks like changing terminology. It looks like redefining words. The dystopian novel 1984 by George Orwell described this with brutal clarity. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. It was fiction, but psychologically precise. The idea was simple. If you control language, you narrow thought. If you narrow thought, you narrow resistance. When words lose stable meaning, reality becomes elastic. And whoever stretches it rules it. In a relationship, the manipulator may redefine loyalty as obedience. He may redefine love as tolerance of disrespect. Slowly, the victim adopts new definitions. In politics, similar shifts occur on a broader canvas. Policies are renamed. Failures are reframed as strategic sacrifices. Surveillance becomes security. Censorship becomes protection. Words are not neutral. They are containers for perception. Control the container, control the interpretation. Hannah Arendt observed that totalitarian systems depend not merely on lies, but on the destruction of the distinction between truth and falsehood. When people can no longer confidently say what is real, they withdraw from judgment. They become cynical. And cynicism is fertile ground for control. Because when nothing feels true, the loudest voice feels safest. The most dangerous moment is not when people are forced to believe a lie. It is when they stop believing they can know anything at all. In a relationship, that moment arrives quietly. The victim stops arguing. Stops defending their version. They say, maybe you're right. Not because they are convinced, but because certainty feels exhausting. At a national scale, exhaustion works the same way. Information overload. Contradictory narratives. Endless debates about what is obvious. The population becomes tired. And tired minds seek simple anchors. Tell me what to think. Tell me what's real. The leader who offers clarity, even false clarity, becomes magnetic. Gustave Le Bon noted that crowds are moved more by affirmation than by evidence. A repeated assertion carries more emotional weight than a nuanced argument. Gaslighting thrives in repetition. Repeat a distortion long enough, and it begins to feel familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance. The brain equates repetition with truth. This is not weakness. It is cognitive efficiency. We are wired to conserve energy. Questioning everything is expensive. Accepting a stable narrative is efficient. And manipulators understand efficiency. Consider the psychological mechanism underneath gaslighting. Cognitive dissonance. When reality conflicts with what a trusted authority says, the brain experiences tension. To reduce that tension, one of two things must change: the perception of reality or the trust in authority. In a relationship where emotional dependence is high, trust in the manipulator remains intact. So perception shifts. Maybe I misunderstood. In a nation where identity is tied to leadership or ideology, the same process unfolds. Maybe the facts are wrong. Maybe the critics are biased. Dissonance resolves in favor of belonging. This is why gaslighting is more powerful than brute force. Force creates visible opposition. Gaslighting creates internal confusion. Confused people do not revolt. They hesitate. They debate themselves. They freeze. And during that freeze, power consolidates. Carl Jung spoke about the danger of unconscious projection. When individuals project their shadow onto an external enemy, they feel morally justified. Gaslighting at a national level often includes creating moral binaries. We are pure. They are corrupt. Once the moral frame is set, contradictory evidence is dismissed as hostile fabrication. Reality becomes tribal. Truth becomes partisan. Ask yourself, what happens when a person no longer trusts their own perception? They outsource it. They search for a stable authority. In a relationship, that authority becomes the manipulator. In a state, it becomes the centralized narrative. The tragedy is subtle. People believe they are choosing certainty. In reality, they are surrendering autonomy. The most disturbing truth about gaslighting is this: it does not require evil genius. It requires understanding of human vulnerability. We all fear being wrong. We all fear isolation. When someone confidently denies our experience, the social brain panics. If I'm wrong, I lose connection. So we adjust. We soften. We reinterpret. Now imagine millions adjusting simultaneously. Millions softening their doubt. Millions choosing belonging over accuracy. This is gaslighting at scale. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Incremental. Administrative. Repeated. Until the abnormal feels routine. Until questioning feels deviant. Until reality itself feels negotiable. And once reality becomes negotiable, power becomes absolute. Pause. The most dangerous moment is when a person stops trusting their own eyes. Because when perception collapses, resistance collapses with it. Control deepens in silence. Not loud silence, social silence. The slow removal of alternative voices. In a relationship, isolation rarely begins with a command. It begins with suggestion. Your friends don't really understand you. Your family has always judged you. They're jealous of what we have. At first, it sounds protective. Caring. Strategic. The manipulator positions himself as the only safe interpreter of reality. He does not immediately cut connections. He contaminates them. Every outside voice becomes suspect. Every differing opinion becomes hostile. Over time, the victim begins to withdraw voluntarily. Invitations decline. Calls go unanswered. Not because they are forced, but because doubt has been planted. And doubt changes behavior. Isolation is not about physical distance. It is about epistemic monopoly. If I am your only source of truth, your only emotional anchor, your only validator, I become your world. And a world with one center is easy to control. Now scale it. A state does not need to lock every border immediately. It begins by redefining external influence. Foreign media becomes propaganda. International criticism becomes attack. Academic dissent becomes subversion. Slowly, alternative perspectives are framed as threats. The psychological mechanism is identical to the domestic version. Contaminate trust. Once trust erodes, withdrawal follows. Historically, the metaphor of the Iron Curtain described more than a geopolitical boundary. It symbolized informational separation. Two realities developing in parallel, each internally coherent, each insulated from contradiction. When comparison disappears, doubt weakens. And doubt is the seed of independence. Here is the core formula. Isolation equals absence of comparison. And without comparison, there is no friction. Without friction, belief hardens. Imagine living in a room with only one mirror. You would never know if the reflection is distorted. Only multiple mirrors reveal asymmetry. In relationships, friends and family act as mirrors. They say, "That doesn't sound right. You deserve better." Remove those mirrors, and distortion becomes normal. In nations, independent media, academic freedom, and open borders function as mirrors. Remove them, and the dominant narrative becomes self-reinforcing. Gustave Le Bon observed that crowds, once unified, resist outside correction. They prefer internal coherence over external truth. Isolation strengthens that coherence. The group identity becomes primary. The external world becomes abstract. Even dangerous. Fear accelerates isolation. In relationships, the manipulator often introduces subtle threats. People will use you. No one else would tolerate you. Fear reduces exploration. The nervous system narrows its focus to safety. And safety is defined as proximity to the manipulator. In political systems, external enemies serve a similar function. A constant narrative of threat justifies closed borders, restricted information, and centralized authority. The population feels protected while becoming contained. Carl Jung spoke of the collective shadow, the tendency of groups to project unwanted traits onto outsiders. Isolation intensifies projection. We are good. They are corrupt. The less contact there is with the outside, the easier it becomes to maintain caricatures. And caricatures justify control. Isolation also reshapes identity. When a person's social circle shrinks to one dominant influence, their self-concept adapts. They begin to see themselves through that singular lens. I am difficult. I am lucky to be tolerated. These beliefs are not imposed directly. They are inferred from repeated interaction within a closed system. In a nation, identity narrows the same way. National mythology intensifies. Nuance fades. Complexity feels disloyal. The story becomes simpler, cleaner, more emotionally satisfying. But also more rigid. And rigidity is easy to steer. Ask yourself, why is comparison so powerful? Because comparison activates critical thinking. It introduces alternative models. It disrupts inevitability. Isolation removes alternatives. And when there are no visible alternatives, the present condition feels permanent. In relationships, the isolated partner often says, "This is just how relationships are." In isolated societies, citizens may say, "This is just how the world works." Permanence breeds compliance. Hannah Arendt argued that total domination requires loneliness. Not just physical separation, existential loneliness. The feeling that one's experience is not shared or validated by others. When individuals feel alone in their doubt, they suppress it. They conform. Because dissent feels like isolation within isolation. This is the final layer. Internalized isolation. Even when alternatives exist, the person no longer seeks them. Even when information is accessible, it is avoided. The psychological walls become stronger than physical ones. At that stage, control no longer requires constant enforcement. It has been absorbed. The relationship feels inescapable. The system feels unquestionable. And here lies the brutal elegance of isolation. It does not shout. It does not declare itself. It simply reduces the number of voices in your head until only one remains. Pause. When there is only one voice left, whose voice is it? Control does not begin with fear. It begins with seduction. In relationships, the manipulator rarely opens with criticism. He opens with intensity. Compliments that feel almost overwhelming. You're different. I've never felt this way before. You're the only one who understands me. Attention becomes oxygen. Messages flood in. Gifts appear. Promises expand into the future. The target feels chosen. Elevated. Special. This is not accidental. It is strategic acceleration of attachment. Psychologically, love bombing triggers dopamine and oxytocin, reward and bonding chemicals. The nervous system associates the manipulator with euphoria. And once euphoria imprints, withdrawal becomes painful. Now scale it. A nation in uncertainty is emotionally vulnerable. Economic instability. Cultural shifts. Identity crises. Into that anxiety steps a voice promising greatness. We are exceptional. A golden age is coming. History will remember us. The tone is triumphant. Expansive. The collective chest rises. Pride replaces insecurity. This is national love bombing. It is not policy. It is emotional intoxication. The mechanism mirrors the relationship dynamic. First, elevation. Then, identification. Then, dependency. The leader does not simply propose reforms. He embodies destiny. He becomes the symbolic father, warrior, savior. Carl Jung described archetypes embedded in the collective unconscious. The hero. The king. The redeemer. When a leader consciously or unconsciously activates these archetypes, logic becomes secondary. Archetypes bypass analysis. They speak directly to ancient survival circuits. Follow the strong protector. In relationships, the manipulator may say, "No one will ever love you like I do." In politics, the rhetoric shifts. "No one will ever defend you like I will." The structure is identical. Exclusivity creates dependency. Gratitude replaces scrutiny. Love bombing also creates contrast. The early intensity sets a high emotional baseline. Later, when affection is withdrawn, or promises are delayed, the target chases the original high. In nations, this can manifest as nostalgia. Remember when we felt united? Remember when hope was strong? Citizens long to return to the emotional peak. And longing reduces resistance. Gustave Le Bon noted that crowds are moved by images and grand illusions more than by detailed programs. A myth of greatness mobilizes faster than a spreadsheet of reforms. Love bombing at scale relies on spectacle. Massive rallies. Symbols. Slogans. Chants. Ritual reinforces belonging. Belonging amplifies emotional investment. The individual dissolves into collective euphoria. And in euphoria, critical thought softens. The cult of personality emerges naturally from this dynamic. Not always through coercion, often through projection. The population projects its idealized self-image onto one figure. He becomes the embodiment of national pride. Questioning him feels like questioning oneself. This is the pivot. Because once identity fuses with leadership, criticism feels like betrayal. And betrayal triggers fear. Here the seduction begins to harden. The love becomes conditional. Support proves loyalty. Doubt proves weakness. The same progression occurs in abusive relationships. Initial adoration slowly transforms into expectation. After everything I've done for you, gratitude becomes obligation. Obligation becomes control. Key line. Love bombing is not love. It is an investment in future control. First, euphoria. Then, dependency. Then, fear of losing the source of euphoria. And fear stabilizes obedience. Pause. Ask yourself, how often do people defend power not because they are forced but because they once felt chosen by it? Now the uncomfortable question. Why does this mechanism succeed? Why do intelligent individuals fall into manipulative relationships? Why do educated societies drift toward centralized control? The answer is not stupidity. It is psychology. Humans fear uncertainty more than restriction. Chaos activates the survival brain. When the future feels unpredictable, we crave structure. Even rigid structure. In a relationship, instability makes the manipulator's certainty attractive. At least he knows what he wants. In a nation, crisis makes decisive authority magnetic. At least someone is in control. The brain equates decisiveness with safety. Even when decisiveness hides danger. Humans also crave belonging. Exclusion is neurologically painful. Social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. So when a manipulator offers exclusive belonging, it's us against them, resistance weakens. The crowd. A study of the popular mind by Gustave Le Bon described how individuals submerged in a crowd experience reduced personal responsibility and heightened emotional intensity. The group feels larger than the self. And within that enlargement, personal doubt shrinks. A crowd reacts emotionally faster than it reasons logically. Emotional contagion spreads quicker than evidence. Add repetition. Add isolation. Add love bombing. The mechanism becomes self-sustaining. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, not merely domination over others, but the drive to impose structure on chaos. Both manipulators and followers participate in this drive. One seeks to impose order. The other seeks relief from disorder. Their motivations intersect. Carl Jung warned that when individuals do not confront their inner shadow, they project it outward. In times of instability, societies may project fear and aggression onto symbolic enemies. A strong leader who names that enemy provides psychological relief. Complexity collapses into simplicity. Good versus evil. Us versus them. Simple narratives reduce anxiety. And anxiety reduction feels like truth. Here is the core idea. People prefer simple answers over complex freedom. Freedom requires responsibility. Responsibility requires critical thinking. Critical thinking requires uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. Manipulative systems promise clarity. Clarity feels safe. Even if it is artificial. The final layer is gradual normalization. No drastic leap into darkness. Only incremental shifts. A small compromise here. A rationalization there. In relationships, boundaries erode slowly. In states, freedoms contract gradually. Each step seems tolerable. Until looking back becomes painful. Pause. The mechanism works because it aligns with human nature. Not against it. It does not fight our instincts. It exploits them. And that is what makes it inevitable when left unchecked. Slowly. Quietly. Dictatorship doesn't start with tanks or loud proclamations. It begins with a shift in perception, a subtle twisting of truth, a quiet erosion of certainty. The same mechanisms that manipulate one person in a relationship, the lies, distortions, and subtle control, can shape the minds of millions. And the one who once allowed their reality to be undermined by a partner may one day allow it on the scale of a nation. Control begins with permission, and permission comes when doubt dies quietly within us. The question is not who holds power. The question is, do you recognize the mechanism before it reshapes your reality?